Bible to the book of Hosea. The book of Hosea, that's where our lesson is going to be from this evening, or this morning. Thank you. You caught it. Passed the test. Hosea chapter 4. When looking at America, or Americans in general, American culture, from the outside in, for instance, if there's someone in a different country, Canada, Germany, whatever, when looking at Americans from the outside in, there are a couple things that someone might notice or that someone might say. Some people might say that Americans are violent. They may look at the gun culture in America and the Second Amendment and say, well, the Americans, they are a violent people. Some people may say that Americans are greedy. They'll look at the culture of excess that we have here, how we need the next new thing. Every 2 years there's a new phone, and I have to have the new phone. They might say that we are a greedy people. Some people might say that we're prideful. Americans pride themselves on being Americans, and that's even more true in Texas, where pride is at an all-time high. I mean, we have our own commercials, don't we? Like Dairy Queen, DQ. That's what I like about Texas. I'm pretty sure they don't have that same commercial for North Dakota. It just doesn't work. Or like Chevy driving Texas, Chevy driving Minnesota. That doesn't quite work. So some people may say that we are prideful. Other people may say that we complain. We are complaining people. And I think that's partially accurate. We complain about the weather, and I think that's pretty adequate or accurate when we live in southeast Texas where the weather is bipolar. So I'm sure that's true. We complain about that. At times we complain about our food. Maybe we go to a restaurant and the food isn't exactly how we want it. We complain about politics. The liberals complain about conservatives. Conservatives complain about liberals. We're a complaining people. And at times it becomes like an Olympic sport. Like we try and see who can outdo the other person in complaining. Have you ever heard, oh, you think your kids are bad? Wait till you see my kids. Or maybe someone says, oh yeah, but does your wife do this? Has anybody ever said that? No one's going to fall for that one. Just checking, making sure you guys are awake. We complain about a lot of things in our lives, but we typically don't want other people to complain about us. And that makes sense. We're social creatures. We like to be praised. Studies have been done where, people, if someone likes your comment or your post on Facebook, it releases chemicals, and people like that sort of thing. So we like praise. We don't like others to complain about us. And part of the reason is because when people complain, it's not always right because, we're not perfect. So sometimes when people complain, it's out of arrogance or it's out of ignorance. Maybe they don't know the entire situation. But what I want to think about this morning is, what about when the Lord complains? We don't always have to worry about when someone complains about us. If I receive a complaint, maybe in some instances I need to listen to that and take that to heart. But in other instances, maybe the other person just doesn't know the whole story and I could take it with a grain of salt. But what about when the Lord complains? That's what we're going to talk about this morning. Hosea chapter 4, starting in verse 1, we see this is exactly what the Lord does here in this book. Hosea chapter 4 and verse 1, it says, "Listen to the word of the Lord, O sons of Israel, for the Lord has a case against the inhabitants of the land." Now, I'm reading from the New American Standard. It says the Lord has a case, but other versions may say the Lord has a complaint against the inhabitants of the land. So in this lesson, what we're going to do is we're essentially going to answer one question. Why is God angry with his people? Now, before we go on to answering that question, I do want to say that Ruth and I are extremely glad to be here and work with you guys at least for a little while. I've said this a number of times over the past weeks, at Kleinwood, and I'm going to say it again here, but this is sort of bittersweet because Ruth and I were at Kleinwood for almost 2 years, and we made really good friends, and it's sad to leave, but we are really glad to be here and to work with the congregation here in the furtherance of the kingdom. So we are excited about the work to come here in the future. So the question, why is God angry with his people? Hosea chapter 4 and verse 1 again, please. It says, listen to the word of the Lord, O sons of Israel, for the Lord has a case against the inhabitant, or a complaint against the inhabitants of the land, because there is no faithfulness or kindness or knowledge of God in the land. I want to deal with that first one there. There's no faithfulness in the land. The idea behind that word, it's the idea of truth. These people are not trustworthy. They're not a faithful people. God cannot trust them to be a faithful people. In other words, why is God angry with his people? Well, because there's no integrity in the land. That's exactly what we see in verse 2. In verse 2, we see sort of this list of crimes. Hosea chapter 4 and verse 2, it says, there's swearing, there's deception, murder, stealing, and adultery. They employ violence so that bloodshed follows bloodshed. In these list of crimes, we see a people who just lack integrity. This is a selfish person. They would rather expediency over being honorable. I mean, let's just look at some of the crimes that are mentioned. Why do people lie? Do people lie out of some high moral, principled reasons? Is that why people tell lies? No. People tell lies out of selfishness, out of expediency. If I lie or if I cheat on a test, it's for me. It's so I can get a better grade. If I lie or cheat on my taxes, well, that's for me. I'm not doing that for anybody else. It's so I can have more money. So why do people lie? Why are the people here lying? Because they're selfish. They would rather expediency over honor. Why do people steal? For some principled reason? That's not why people steal. People steal for themselves, out of expediency. These people would rather serve self than serve God. And this is exactly what we see in the first 3 chapters of the book of Hosea. In the first 3 chapters of this book, God tells his prophet Hosea, I want you to marry a woman of harlotry and have children of harlotry. Now, some people may say, why would God want his prophet to do that? Well, God answers. God says, because the people of the land commit flagrant harlotry against me. They are not loyal to me. You see, just like the harlot, Israel was living a life of expediency. Well, we cannot be this way. We need to be a people who focuses on honoring God over serving self. We can't be the type of people who lie, try to alter reality. We can't be that type of a person. We've got to focus on God over self. So why is God angry with his people? He's angry with his people because there's no integrity in the land. But that's not all. Let's go back to Hosea chapter 4. Hosea chapter 4. Read verse 1 again. It says, listen to the word of the Lord, O sons of Israel, for the Lord has a case or a complaint against the inhabitants of the land because there's no faithfulness or kindness or knowledge in the land. Let's focus on that second word here for just a little while. And this word kindness. Now the word that's, the Hebrew word that's translated kindness is the word hesed. Though actually it's the word chesed, but typically when I say that, people respond by saying, God bless you. So hesed is going to work. And hesed is a big word. It's a really big word in the Hebrew. It's translated all kinds of ways. It's translated grace. It's translated kindness. It's translated loyalty, loving kindness. So it's a really big word in the Hebrew. But the basic idea is covenant loyalty. The basic idea is covenantal or relational love. Well, let's boil it down to one word. Why is God angry with his people? Because there's no love in the land. Now, this isn't the type of love, in our culture, we sort of redefine love, and it's not necessarily what it meant back then, but this isn't the type of love where it's like, I've been dating this girl for 2 days, and I really love this girl. I love being around her, and she makes me feel nice. That's not what's going on here. And this isn't legal language. The word hesed talks about covenant loyalty. This isn't overly legal language where you're just sort of in this contract and you're checking items off of a list to fulfill the obligations of the contract. Rather, it's going beyond doing the bare minimum. That's the idea behind this word. It's going beyond doing the bare minimum, going the extra mile, and showing true love for someone. This idea is you can see this idea from the book of Ruth. Let's go there. Ruth chapter 1. Ruth chapter 1. We're going to read verse 8. Ruth chapter 1 and verse 8 It says, and Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. What Naomi is telling her daughters-in-law is, you've done what you needed to do. You know, my sons are dead. You fulfilled your obligations, the obligations of this relationship, and you need to go home now so you can try and find another husband. She's saying to the girls, well, you've done enough. But we know the story. Ruth stays. And Boaz actually praises her for that in chapter 3. Chapter 3 and verse 10, it says, then he said, that's Boaz speaking, then he said, may you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first by not going after young men, whether poor or rich. Now that word kindness there is that word we've been talking about. It's that word hesed. And Boaz is saying, well, you've shown your last hesed, your last kindness, your last love is better than the first. You've gone beyond what was expected of you. You've gone beyond just the bare minimum of your relationship with Naomi. Well, that's the idea behind this word. Going beyond. Doing more than just what's necessary. Let's further cement this idea in our brains. Let's go back to the book of Hosea and look at chapter 6. Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6, this is God speaking. He says, for I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice, in the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. So here God is saying, you know what I want? I want loyalty. I don't want you just to be checking items off the list, doing just the small, minute, bare minimum things of the law. I desire loyalty more than sacrifice. And you know what that word is, the Hebrew word that's translated loyalty? Well, that's that word hesed there again. So that's the idea behind that word. It's going beyond the bare minimum, going and showing true love, essentially, towards someone. And Israel wasn't doing that. As a matter of fact, Israel wasn't even doing the bare minimum. We can look at that list of crimes again, where it talks about the swearing, the deception, the murder, the stealing, and the adultery in chapter 4 and verse 2. We can look at that and see that they weren't even keeping the law. They weren't even trying to do the bare minimum. Well, there are some things that we can learn from this. First of all, we need to make sure that we're not content with just doing the bare minimum. You know, someone might say, well, I come to church 1, 2, or 3 times a week. That's enough, right? That's all I got to do. You know, that's the mentality of like the student who does just enough to pass, like the C student. And no one likes working with that student. Like, you know, if you go through school and college and you've got these group projects, no one likes working with the person who does the bare minimum, because that's more work on you. Well, let me just say, God does not like working with the person who's just going to try and do the bare minimum. God wants a people who are loyal to Him, not a people who are just interested in doing the least amount of work that they can do. We need to make sure that we live lives of love, because God is angry with the Israelites because there is no love in the land. But that's not all. Let's go back to verse 1. God says, I have a complaint against the inhabitants of the land because there's no faithfulness or kindness or knowledge of God in the land. Here, finally, God complains that there is no knowledge in the land. In verse 6, God says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. So why is God complaining against His people? Simply, there's no knowledge in the land. And part of the problem with the Israelites is they're not listening to the people they should be listening to. They're not listening to the priests. Let's look at verse 4 of chapter 4. It says, yet let no one find fault, and let none offer reproof, for your people are like those who contend with the priest. God is saying here that these people are arguing with the priest. The priests are the ones who are supposed to keep them on the straight and narrow, and they would rather listen to the world around them. They would rather listen to these false idols rather than listening to God. You know, this issue is highlighted in Hosea chapter 2. Hosea chapter 2 and verse 4. It says, also I will have no compassion on her children, because they are children of harlotry. For their mother, and God is talking about Israel here, for their mother has played the harlot. She who conceived them has acted shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers, who will give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, my oil and my drink. The Israelites here are saying, I'm gonna focus on the world and these other nations and these other gods because they are the ones who are blessing me. The other nations and the other gods are the ones giving me the oil and the flax. They're the ones blessing me with all of these things. And the problem is the children of Israel they just can't see the truth. They just don't have the knowledge to know who it is who is truly giving them and blessing them with those things. God says in verse 8 here of chapter 2, "For she does not know that it was I who gave her the grain. I gave her the new wine and the oil, and I lavished on her silver and gold, which they used for Baal." God says these people can't see the truth because they don't have the knowledge. They're following after these other nations. They're following after these other gods, thinking they are blessing Israel with the blessings. But God says, it was me. And you just can't see it. Their lack of knowledge is emphasized in chapter 4 and verse 2, looking at this list of crimes: the swearing, the deception, the murder, the stealing, and the adultery. If you pay attention, you'll notice that most, and maybe just even all, just depending on how you interpret it, all of these crimes listed in verse 2 are somewhere else in Scripture. You know where they are? Well, they're in the Ten Commandments. You see, Israel, they were missing things that should have just been the basic things for them. They're sitting here arguing with the priest about murder. The priest is saying, I really don't think you guys should be doing that murder thing. And they're like, no, we're going to debate you on that. You see, the Israelites, they were struggling and they were debating about things that they never should have been debating about. These were the basic things. These were the things in the Ten Commandments, and they couldn't see it. They should have known. The psalmist talks about this type of phenomenon in Psalm chapter 115. Psalm 115 teaches us about the effects of idolatry. Psalm 115, starting in verse 4, it says, "Their idols are silver and gold, the work of man's hands. They have mouths, but they cannot speak. They have eyes, but they cannot see. They have ears, but they cannot hear. They have noses, but they cannot smell. They have hands, but they cannot feel. They have feet, but they cannot walk. They cannot make a sound with their throat." And here's the important statement here in verse 8. "Those who make them will become like them, everyone who trusts in him." You see, the psalmist tells us something important. The people who make and worship these idols, or make and even worship the things in the world just in general, well, they become like those things. They become blind to where they can't see the truth. They become deaf to where they cannot hear the truth. Well, this is where Israel was. They couldn't even see the basic things anymore. God was complaining because these people lacked knowledge. Well, we've got to be a different people. God shouldn't look down on us in the United States or on us in Texas or on us here at the Dowling Road congregation and say, I have a complaint against this people because they lack knowledge. But it seems that's the way the world is going. Now it's the basic things that we in the world today are starting to miss. It's the things that we never should be debating about that we are currently debating about. We're debating about whether boys are boys and girls are girls. We should know that. That should be pretty simple. A big moral debate in today's society is whether it's okay or not to kill babies in the womb. That's pretty basic. That should not be the debate that we are currently having in our society. See, it's the obvious things that we are starting to miss. It's things that we should know that are sparking debate. We got to make sure that we have knowledge because God complains that Israel has no knowledge. So one more thing that I want us to notice. Let's go to chapter 4 and verse 3 now. Chapter 4 and verse 3, here God is telling the people the result of their sin. Chapter 4 and verse 3, "Therefore the land mourns, and everyone who lives in it languishes, along with the beast of the field and the birds of the sky, and also the fish of the sea disappear." Just a couple of points on this verse here. First of all, Israel's sin doesn't just stay with them. Israel's sin has an effect on the world around them. The beginning of the verse says, therefore the land mourns, and everyone who lives in it languishes, along with the beasts of the field and the birds of the sky. You see, their sin has an impact on the world around them. And the same is true of us. Our sin doesn't just stay with us. It has an impact on the world around us. So one more point, just here at the end. It says at the end of this verse, and also the fish of the sea disappear. That's sort of judgment language. You know, it's similar to other types of judgment language that we see in the prophets, sort of this idea of uncreation, where God is undoing what he created in the beginning in Genesis chapter 1. Maybe you'll read in the prophets, it'll say something like, the sun and moon will be darkened and the stars will not give its light. Well, that's judgment language. God is judging someone, and the language there is really of uncreation. He's undoing day 4 of creation. Well, that's what we see here in verse 3. God is saying, because of the complaint, because of your sin, well, judgment is going to come. And that's another lesson for us to learn, because judgment is going to come for us also. A judgment where God will completely uncreate the world with fire. And we need to be ready for that judgment. So let me just close with this question. Are you ready? Are you ready for the judgment that is to come? You know, maybe there's someone sitting here this morning who's not ready. Maybe there's someone sitting here this morning who God would say, I have a complaint against this person for reason X, Y, or Z. Maybe there's someone here who's living that life and they want to change that. We'd love to help you with that this morning. Or maybe there's someone else who wants to become a part of God's saved people through baptism. We can help you with that also. Whatever you need, you can come now as we stand and as we sing.